morning. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us tonight. For those that don't know me, I'm Emma Basir. I'm the manager of civic engagement at SAGE, which is the nation's largest and oldest organization advocating for the rights and dignity of LGBTQ plus older adults. I'll be the moderator for you today. This is part two in a series of voter engagement webinars SAGE is hosting with very generous support of AARP, who's a great partner of ours all across the country. If you're interested in getting involved in our work a little bit more and learning about how you can be an advocate for LGBTQ plus elders, you can visit www.sageusa.org or reach out to advocacy@sageusa.org. I'm going to put those links in the chat so you can make sure that you all can get them. And then I will also be following up, at a later date. And I will do my best to keep an eye on the chat as well as my amazing co-panelists. We also want to direct folks to the question and answer, which we already see. So Greg, yes, you should be able to have access to the chat. If you don't, I'm going to see if I can fix that. And yes, we can't see attendees. This is just something that we do want a lot of. Okay, good to know. Thank you, Liz, that chat is disabled. Okay, it shouldn't have been disabled, so that's odd. And yes, that's just something we do for a lot of our bigger events, just for an anonymity. Some folks like to join without having their name and face on there. So yeah, a few housekeeping things. If you'd like to enable closed captioning for this event, please go to the bottom of your Zoom screen and click the button that says More in the bottom right with 3 dots. A menu will pop up where you'll be able to select captions, and then another menu will open and you can select Show Captions. If you'd like to see a full transcript of the event, click Show Transcript. I also like to remind our speakers and myself, because I tend to ramble and trip over my words a lot, just to try to speak as slowly as possible, as you feel comfortable, so that the captions can be as accurate as possible. You can also change the style of your captions and the size by clicking caption settings in the same menu in case you need it to be a little bit bigger in order to see. And then a new window will open where you can make the captions larger or smaller. As I said, the event will be recorded for those who are unable to make it and posted on our YouTube page. We'll have time at the end for questions and answers, so please feel free to ask your questions using the Q&A function. And since our chat doesn't seem to be working today and I want to get moving, we can just use the Q&A as a chat function, and I'll try to keep an eye on it. So if you'd like to receive updates from SAGE, I'm going to drop a link in the chat. I also encourage our folks, our partners on here, if you have a link to sign up for updates with your organization, feel free to drop that in the chat so that folks can hear about what you're working on moving forward. And without further ado, I'd like to get started so we get to kind of address everything we'd like to address. So I wanted to start by introducing some of our amazing panelists and talk about kind of a little bit about their work and how their organization is helping folks prepare for the 2022 midterms. So Nicole, we're going to start with you from Equality Florida. Nicole Parker is an Orlando native of Black, Puerto Rican, and Italian descent. At the age of 19, she left her job at a childhood home to begin her journey of living authentically. Nicole's passion is advocating for human rights, protections for all, and the importance of everyone having a seat at the table. Nicole is a director for transgender equality at Florida and also the co-founder, director of operations for the Gender Advancement Project, and sits on the board of the Center Orlando. Through her advocacy, Nicole hopes to encourage open dialogue on gender issues, state and federal protections for all, and linkage to proper transitioning resources. Her hope is to teach people that the Black market way of transitioning is not the only way. So Nicole, kind of hand it over to you and talk a little bit about the work that Equality Florida is doing this year during the midterms, and you can feel free to add anything else that you'd like to your introduction.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Once again, my name is Nicole Parker, pronoun she, her, and I'm the Director of Transgender Equality for Equality Florida. So Equality Florida, if you're not familiar, is the state's largest LGBTQ civil rights organization, and we are celebrating our 25th year this year. So as we get into election time and it's getting ready to vote, our 501c4 is working heavily to make sure that we are putting out voting guides and making sure that folks understand, that you are able to vote regardless of especially being trans or non-binary, I'm going to kind of go there. I know that there's a lot of hesitation, and we're going to kind of get into that later on. But regardless, gender discrepancies, as they call them, are not a valid reason to deny someone to vote. And I really just want to make sure that I say that out loud, because as a trans person, before my name was changed, I was a little hesitant to go vote. I didn't really know if I was going to be judged, but I want you to know that regardless if your name is changed or not, voting is for all of us, and it is a right that we have. So I want to make sure that you all are empowered to do that as well. So I know that we'll jump kind of more into that, but I'm excited to be here and share space with you all today.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you so much for your work, Nicole. Kaylin, I'd like to come to you first. So Kaylin's a seasoned political strategist and campaign director with 24 years of experience in elections, voter education, political intelligence, grassroots organizing, advocacy, congressional and legislative relations, external outreach, coalition building, and legislative analysis. So combined, a lot more than a lot of people, than most people. For over 20 years, Kaylin has been a part of ARP's advocacy and education efforts. He's currently directing 50 Voters 50 Plus, Our Voices Decide, the association's voter engagement and education campaign. In 2021, he ran AARP's vaccine education campaign and has a BA in government and psychology from the University of Texas at Austin. Kaylin, thank you so much for joining us.
Great. Thanks so much, Emma, and delighted to join you, Nicole, and Aaron on this really important virtual panel today to talk about the election. We're just over 2 weeks away till the general election. A lot is on the line, and I want to talk through the resources that AARP has to help all voters, especially voters over the age of 50, know what they need to do to go cast a ballot.
Yeah. And lastly, we'll go to my colleague, Aaron Tax. Aaron is the Managing Director of Government Affairs and Policy Advocacy for SAGE. He advocates for LGBTQ plus inclusive federal aging policies that account for the unique needs of LGBTQ plus older adults. And unfortunately, we couldn't have our speakers today due to a few conflicts from Florida Rising, but they're a great organization that does amazing work across the state. And I highly recommend reaching out to see how they're engaging around the election, how they're prioritizing communities of color this year. I just want to give a great shout out to Florida Rising, which is a really great organization doing work in Florida on the ground. So yeah, Aaron, I'll pass it to you.
All right. So you've heard about SAGE from Emma already, but I'm Aaron. I use he, him pronouns, based in DC. And I'll be, after Kaylin presents a little later, I believe I'm going to be presenting a little bit about some of the challenges that LGBT older folks face and how that in turn might impact how, why, and when they vote. There you go.
So thanks everyone for joining us and sharing us a little information. And as Aaron said, we're going to go to Kaylin to kind of get an understanding of how older adults experience voter suppression, what AARP is kind of doing about it this year, and what we need to know when thinking about voting and older adults.
Sure. Thanks so much, Emma. And it's amazing to me. I've been doing this for a number of years, as you recited my bio, which is embarrassing, but that the act of voting itself has become partisan in some circles. And I've seen this happen over, at least over the last year for sure, but it's been slowly, or maybe rapidly in some cases happening all across the country, from voter identification requirements to changes in absentee voting, early voting, making it more onerous for people to vote. And AARP's perspective is, we want to obviously protect ballot integrity, but we want to make sure people have the ability to cast a vote, making it easier. The pandemic made it a lot tougher for folks to be able to go vote in person. And so we advocated for the ability for people to vote safely in the 2020 election. As a result of what happened in the 2020 election, we saw a lot of states like Georgia, Arizona, my home state of Texas, changing Florida, changing voting requirements to make it tougher for people to vote. And some of the things that I mentioned. And when you're talking about older Americans, older adults, some of whom have given up their driver's license because they don't drive anymore. My mom is somebody who is in her early 70s. She still has her driver's license, but has chosen not to drive anymore. Or people who live in long-term care facilities, who need the ability to be able to cast a ballot remotely. Things have gotten a lot tougher. But the thing I kind of want to focus in on is, I think the biggest kind of voter suppression that's out there, I think, is voter apathy. And it's really easy to kind of get caught up in that. And I think I see it true for a lot of younger people of my generation and younger, who say, well, my vote, doesn't matter. I voted, in the last election, I didn't get exactly what I wanted. When that's not how voting works. It's not an immediate gratification. It's not something that you get immediately. It's something that you have to do as an engaged citizen, showing up to vote in every election, not just the presidential elections, not just in elections that are in years that end in an even number, but local elections, school board elections are important, ballot initiative elections are important, like bond elections are important. Showing up every time and making it habitual, and then engaging our elected leaders and holding them accountable to the promises they made in the campaign trail, I think is absolutely key. Because I tell you who's not apathetic, it's the other side. They show up every time, and if you choose not to show up, you've automatically ceded ground to them. And we've seen that happen a lot in the last few years, and some of my colleagues here on this call will talk about that today. As far as what AARP has done, we have tried to combat voter suppression from a legislative and a litigation standpoint. In some cases, we've been successful in carving out exceptions for older Americans. In other cases, we haven't been, because it's become more and more partisan. And when you have states controlled by one party, when they control the trifecta, that makes it really tough to be able to combat that, even with the resources that AARP has and other organizations have at their disposal. So what we've done in this election cycle in our campaign that Emma mentioned, Voters 50 Plus, Our Voices Decide, is a central part of it is making sure, regardless of where you live, you have the information you need to go vote. You have the where, when, how. And so we've created election guides for every single state that are updated. They're well laid out. They're easy to read. We have them in English and in Spanish, and in some cases we've done them in some other languages based on the needs of our constituency in key areas. But either I or Emma will put this in the chat. It's the Q&A, rather, not the chat, sorry. It's the www.aarp.org/election guides. That's where you can find any state's election guide. I know we have a lot of Floridians on today, so the one for Florida specifically, it's aarp.org/flvotes, or if you want it in Spanish, aarp.org/flvota. And we also have the ability, if you have your smartphone with you, if you text 22777, so 22777, and just put FL Votes or FL Vota in there, you'll get your election guide sent directly to you. And that's publicly available information. You can share that with your folks in your network, with your friends, family, colleagues, you name it. You want to make sure that they have that. And then the where, when, how is really important, but the why is super important. And what AARP, the issues that we advocate behalf, making sure people have a secure financial security, retirement security, healthcare, prescription drug affordability, you name it. We make sure that we try to get the candidates on record on where they stand, so people can look at that and make choices based on their views and values, based on what they hear from the candidates. Doesn't always work out that way, but that's something that we try to do. And at least we try to get the candidates on record and hold them accountable once they're in office on that. And we've also, I'll put this in the chat as well, we've started a new initiative called In My Shoes, where this came up from some focus groups that we did earlier this year, where we had a woman talking about how she wishes that President Biden and Mitch McConnell and Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi could come over to her house to see what she has to deal with on a day-to-day basis. And I think that's true of whether you're queer or you're not queer, of things that you have to deal with on a day-to-day basis. The people that you vote for or elect may not know exactly what you're doing. And so I recommend you go to our site, check it out, share your story, and be able to share that with folks in your communities. So with that, I will turn it back over to you, Emma.
Yeah, thank you, Kaylin, for that great overview. And I want to just acknowledge seeing some questions in the chat. We're going to do questions and answers kind of at the end, but I promise we'll save some space. We see the questions. So yeah, Aaron, I wonder if you could kind of speak briefly to specifically, Kaylin talked about older adults more generally, but I wonder if you could speak a little bit more toward how LGBTQ plus older adults in particular experience voting, why they may not feel that they have a voice, some of the thoughts that are, spinning around in our heads as we approach election season,
Sure.
or as we're in election season.
Go for it.
And Colin, did you have something to say before I jump in?
No, you got it.
Okay, cool. So I'll start with a little anecdote of a client of mine from an old job. His name was Melvin, and he was serving in the military in World War II. And while he was serving in the military, he was trading letters with his boyfriend at the time, and someone discovered those letters. And as a result, he was put under investigation and thrown into the Navy brig, into the prison for several weeks, went under a psychological evaluation, and ultimately they determined he was in fact gay and discharged him from the military. His paperwork said on it, class 2 homosexual and undesirable. So that was his official characterization from the military, for the next, 50 or so years, until he got in touch with the organization at which I worked, and we were able to help him upgrade that. And I often think about his story when you think about folks of his generation interacting with the government and people in the position of authority. And you could imagine someone like him might be a little bit reluctant to engage with people administering an election, or being open about who he is and his experience, and whether he has a partner or whether he's single or whatnot. So these experiences that this generation has faced really live with them. It's not like we can flip them off with a switch as we make progress around the country. The other thing I'll note, in addition to that, is the challenges that many people of this generation face. And I would say foremost among them is social isolation. It's a population that's twice as likely to be single and 4 times less likely to have kids than their heterosexual and cisgender counterparts. And as a result, they face a lot of challenges in navigating the world. And one of those challenges they might face is voting. So you could imagine, filling out an online voter registration form, or filling out one in person. I was at home last week, and I was helping my dad upload, some forms to like a tax department. And, he had some trouble with it. He didn't see where to find the add button on the screen. He was looking for like a big paperclip button or something like that. And, for people of my generation, I'm a little bit more used to navigating the web. It's something I do each and every day at work, all day long. And it's not something that he was used to doing. So you can imagine something that I might think is super simple, just like registering on a website, might end up being very complicated for someone of this generation. And unfortunately, if you are twice as likely to be single, 4 times less likely to have kids, you may be stuck navigating that process all alone, or just not doing it at all. So that's one of the challenges right there in terms of social isolation we see. In addition to that, imagine trying to get to the polls, or if you go to the polls and you have to wait in line for 8 hours, and who's going to drive you there, who's going to be there with you, who's going to bring you food if that's legal in your state, who's going to bring you water if that's legal in your state, which is ridiculous, we have to say that for the record, but who's going to help you with those things, again, if you're facing that process all alone. In addition to that, we also see a population that's much more likely to face poverty than their heterosexual and cisgender counterparts. And this is something we particularly see with respect to same-sex female couples, with twice the poverty rate of their heterosexual counterparts. We also see this in people with multiple identities, so like trans elders of color, so on and so forth. So people who have more than one marginalized identity, these factors kind of pile on top of each other and create a whole host of challenges, whether that's with respect to poverty or just access to all sorts of voting easier. So that's a second big issue we see. And then the third big issue is lack of access to culturally competent services and supports. And that might be something as simple as, you call, your local government office that's administering the voting in your city, and maybe they ask, what your gender is, or maybe they ask, Are you married? Are you not married? Anything that they might see as relevant to something, and maybe the way they ask those questions might not. And if that's one might quickly say, I'm not going to be well engage with these folks, and maybe that feels safer than trying to vote. So there's all these, all these issues kind of floating around that can create some challenges for folks who simply want to do nothing more than vote. We want to try to lift up those or push away those barriers and make it easier for folks to vote and lift up their voice in the next election.
Yeah, that's a really good segue kind of into our next discussion. I really want to make sure that we're framing this conversation about kind of how our most marginalized communities are suppressed in particular, particularly Black and Brown communities' votes are suppressed at much higher rates intentionally. And because while LGBTQ folks, as we've talked about, face unique voter suppression, it's really our trans siblings of color that Aaron mentioned that really face the brunt of it. So I don't want us to lose sight of that, because kind of on its surface, we're talking about the community more broadly. So I wonder, Nicole and Kaylin, if either of you can take the question, but I wanted to hear about kind of what you all are doing and what we can do, what everybody can do to kind of combat this voter suppression that we're seeing. How can we support our community? How can we invest in community care, especially where and in communities of color where voter suppression is really at its worst, and our trans elders are, afraid of showing their ID at the polls and things like that.
Nicole, did you want to start? No. Oh, okay. All right. I feel like I'm monopolizing time. Yes, I do believe that communities of color are targeted much more for voter suppression. And this is why AARP specifically partnered with a lot of organizations. SAGE is definitely one of them, but also organizations that represent communities of color who are actually going into the community themselves. For example, we're working with an organization called Values Partnerships, which focuses on the communities of faith within the African American communities around the country, where we're providing the information that folks need to be able to cast their ballot. And we know that we have to work directly with organizations like this and with community leaders like this, because the messenger matters as much as the message. And I'll be honest, like AARP is seen as a cisgender white organization. And I say this as a person of color, an immigrant, and somebody who's part of the LGBTQ plus community. And so, we have to be able to work directly with our partners like SAGE, like Values Partnership, like the Hispanic Federation, just to name a few, to be able to make sure that they are utilizing the resources we're providing, but giving them the incentive to folks that they're reaching out to with that. So that's why, I'm really happy that Emma, you and Aaron have put this conversation together because you are leaders in this community. Nicole, you're a leader in the community as well. And we want to make sure that you can use the resources that we're providing, that we have, researchers, writers putting all this stuff together. And we've heard from a lot of folks, and I don't think this is so much as praise for us as much as it is criticism of actual state election resources are so Byzantine and really tough to get through. I've looked at Secretary of State's websites, I've looked at election board websites. Some of them are great, most of them are really bad. And so where we can take that information and provide it in an easy to digest format, we do. Rather than using like buzzwords or jargon, we want to use simple, plain language where we can. It makes it easy for anybody to go vote.
Yeah, and it's really the education piece for me. So here I'm based in Orlando, and I do want to acknowledge, I call it like the inclusive bubble of Florida. So, we are lucky here to have a lot of trans-led organizations, and I've been able to work with them to have listening sessions or just talk with the community about what the fears are. And what is very interesting is what's come up of that is we did one listening session and it went on for about 2 hours. And folks were just talking about how terrified they were to go in if identity documents weren't changed, or can I wear my affirming t-shirt? Or, what if somebody knows that I'm trans in the line and, makes fun of me or something like that? These are all genuine fears, because if you take away voting, this happens to trans and non-binary people every single day. But then now, as we see the consistent attacks on trans and non-binary people are scared to go stand in line, just living authentically, going to vote, which is their right to do. And it's really just educating folks on, this is a space for you too. And I want to say that again, that voting is a space for everybody. It is a right that we have, and we should be able to go and cast that vote as an American. So it's just understanding and getting the community to know that there's a lot of people who, like Kaylin said, feel like their vote doesn't matter. And it's really getting the community to understand your vote does matter. There are millions of us. And if all of us vote, that's how we're able to change the game. And I know that we're going to kind of talk about the ballot, what's on the ballot later, but there are so many key races going on right now and key election items that folks need to vote on. So if you're kind of in that space where you're like, I don't know if I want to vote, I don't know if my vote matters, please understand your vote does matter, and please utilize that right.
Yeah, thank you, Nicole. That was great. I think that's so related to what I want to talk about next too, which is around kind of the specific voter ID laws and talking about kind of what we need to be prepared to vote. We have, like we mentioned, all of this uncertainty about driver's licenses and gender markers not matching your gender identity, but then also what Aaron mentioned with older adults not necessarily always having driver's licenses and needing, a different kind of state issued ID and having to go through all of those municipal, having to go to the DMV and get a different kind of, and your town hall and get a different kind of ID and things like that. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about kind of maybe some specific laws that folks should be aware of. People, one thing that I always think of, you can't be turned away at the polls because your gender doesn't match your ID. That is not, you can cast a provisional ballot, you can request a provisional ballot, but a lot of folks don't think about that. They just they get turned away. So I wondered if you all could kind of touch upon some of the things that you really want people to know and be aware of as they prepare to go vote.
Sure. First and foremost, the voter registration deadline for here in Florida, at least, was on the 11th. So I hope you were able to get registered to vote. And also, federal law protects your right to bring anyone into the polling booth to assist you with voting, aside from your employer or your union rep. A friend, a family member, a person that you feel safe with is able to go in there with you. And please utilize that. You know what I mean? If that makes you feel safe, if that makes you feel a bit more comfortable, please do. And also, voters with disabilities may request an accessible vote by mail ballot. I know that we're getting kind of close to the time that it is to vote. So, if you want to do that, please contact the elections office ASAP. Typically, you would want to plan that a little bit sooner, but hey, just wanted to put that out there. And also, for those that speak a different language, every county must offer a Spanish ballot for Spanish speaking voters. I've had a lot of conversations with people who are like, well, I don't really speak English, and I know they don't do ballots in Spanish. And I'm like, no, yes, they do. Absolutely. Please ask for that. Please know that you have a right to ask for that. And then of course, vote by mail is a safe and reliable way. I know that last election, there was this big talk about vote by mail and all of these things, but please understand that that is a valid way to vote. It is counted, and there are tracking mechanisms now. There are ways that you can put your vote in by mail and then track to make sure that it's been received by the office and things of that nature as well. So those are just kind of a few ways, but would love to throw it to any of the other panelists to add to them.
I think you covered it.
That was a great overview. And plus, we always have, as I mentioned, as Kaylin mentioned, we have a few election guides that do a great job of kind of distilling all of the deadlines, finding your polling location, everything that you need to know when heading to the polls. And something that I'd love to also kind of talk about is a big part of our work and a big part of a lot of work of LGBTQ organizations is fostering intergenerational connections. It can be really difficult. We tend to kind of stay in our own age groups and mingle together. But there's also this very strong desire that I work with older folks every day, and that they really we want to be talking with people who are younger, and younger people are like, yeah, I want to know who came before us. I want to talk to our elders. So I wonder if you all could kind of chat about kind of how, from both perspectives, how a younger person could help an older person this election season and beyond, and then kind of vice versa. As we talked about, older folks tend to be a little bit more reliable voters than younger people, unfortunately. So we want to also make sure that we have our older adults are kind of working with younger folks about getting to the polls, understanding how important it is, and everything that Nicole mentioned. Kaylin, if you want to start and chat a little bit about kind of how older folks can help younger folks and vice versa.
Sure. So one of the things that we did last cycle, and we're doing this cycle again, partner with a group called Power the Polls, which is about recruiting intergenerational poll workers. So if you go vote in person, more often than not, the median age of somebody who's working the polls is probably somebody over the age of 50, likely over 60, maybe even like getting close to 70. And we want to get younger people more involved in the process, because if they're more involved in the process, then they see the importance of voting. But yeah, you're absolutely right. Like, look, in a midterm like this one, there will be a bunch of drop-off voters from the presidential election. Although I've seen some numbers about early voting that are shattering records from 2 years ago, a presidential year. And 4 years ago, that was the highest turnout midterm since like 1918 or something. It was like a 100-year high, which is great to see. Even then, older voters make up the majority of the electorate. They just do. That's a point that we make at AARP, because that's our advocacy work and our mission. But the more people who do vote, I think the better we are as a democracy, the more engaged we are. And so what we try to encourage our members to have intergenerational conversations about not just the importance of voting as an act, but the importance of why. Kind of going back to why elections are important. Look, people, I'm trying to remember the quote exactly, but it was early in my career, but there was an elected leader in Texas who said, a citizen that says that they're not interested in politics or elections or voting is like a drowning person saying they're not interested in water. It's all around you. You can't escape it. It's there. So you may as well take advantage of it. And for, if you don't vote, you're essentially letting somebody else choose who makes decisions for you, from, decisions about Social Security and Medicare. There's questions and comments in the chat about that, to the cost of prescription drugs, to, gender affirming care, to voting. If you don't show up, these people are going to make these decisions. And it's going to happen at every level of government. And so making this habitual, understanding what your rights are, showing up every single time you can, and bringing a friend with you, or a group of friends, making a group activity. We encourage that, especially to help prevent isolation, but also to make voting seem like less of a scary or less of an onerous activity. The more we can do that, I think the better off we'll be.
So I just wanted to share some information from one of our attendees who's paying attention, that the mail-in or the deadline for requesting a mail-in ballot is October 29th at 5 p.m. So even if you maybe miss some of these other deadlines, it appears that you can still do that one at least. And I will put the link, it's kind of buried here in the chat of some of these deadlines. There you go.
Yeah, thank you. Love having deadlines in the chat to remind us, because I'm definitely someone, if it's not in my calendar, I am forgetting. I have many reminders to head to the polls to early vote. I can do that in my state. So Nicole, I wonder if you could kind of talk about kind kind of on the other hand too of younger folks working with older folks, and also kind of broader than that too. I think a lot of what we do at Sage is not just about election season. It's about advocating to vote, and kind of as Kaylin mentioned earlier, it's also about holding those elected officials accountable after the election, and building coalition with folks to make sure that, you know, our LGBTQ older folks can actually age with dignity and respect, and, you know, hopefully relationships with younger people. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that intergenerational angle.
Yeah, you know, and I think that's so important that we do have these conversations and think of it that way. That was one of the conversations at one of the listening sessions I was at. There was a couple older folks that were like, well, you know, I guess I have somebody who can go with me. And we actually paired them up with two younger people, and they're all going to go together to vote. And I was like, you can go vote and grab a bite to eat, or go get ice cream, or just do something fun, you know what I mean? And make it a habit. You know, when it's time to vote, you all go together, but it's important that we all stick together. It's important to understand that the hate that we're seeing in the world and everything like that is just increasing. And a way for us to combat that is to be united as a community, you know. And I do want to say it, sometimes as the LGBTQ plus community, we can be the worst to each other. And we have to kind of break that down sometimes. You know, I think there's some intolerance on every, you know, on every level. And we just have to kind of acknowledge that and realize that we are better together and we're more united. And an attack against one of us is an attack against all of us. And when we stand in that, I think we are so much stronger, and the power is in the people. You know what I mean? We have this right to vote. And if you see somebody struggling, or if you're out, even at the polls, you know what I mean? And just try to bring somebody with you. That's what I encourage. You know, I'm going to put that out there. Let's not vote alone this year. Let's try to bring somebody with us. Hey, let's bring 5 people with us. You know what I mean? Let's make an event out of it. But it's just so important that we do this. I cannot say that enough. I just feel like I've had so many conversations over the past couple of weeks, especially with trans folks, with the attack on healthcare, the attack on everything that we're seeing. People are just like, I give up. And I'm like, we cannot give up. If you think all the way back to Stonewall, the reason why we are here is because folks did not give up. And things, even though things are tough now, things have been really, really, really tough in history. But how we overcome that is just by pushing through it. You know, sometimes it may get muddy, but at the end of the day, we'll be able to wipe our face and keep going. So, you know, I just wanted to kind of just put that little bit of inspiration out there, because if you cut on the news, you know, as a trans person, cutting on the news and seeing our existence be debated by people every single day is exhausting. It's hard. But it also, what gives me hope, I will say, is the younger generation. They do not care. They live out loud. They live authentically. They are ready to fight. And that gives me hope, you know what I mean? Because it is tough. But one way that we can push back, like I've said 100 times, is voting. And I encourage you to bring somebody with you this year.
Yeah, and this might kind of address one of the questions in the chat too, but one of the resources that's on AARP's guide is kind of breaking down kind of everything that's on the ballot this year in Florida, or all of the major races that are in Florida. And I want to make sure, folks, I feel like a lot of times we think about the presidential election, we think about like my senator, but we don't always think about, maybe we don't think about our member of Congress who's in our congressional district. We don't think about our state senator as much. We don't think about our state representatives as much. So I wonder if, Nicole, if you want to talk a little bit about kind of some of the really key races that are happening in Florida this year, the broader sort of climate in Florida that we're coming up against. Talk a little bit about, I know we have a question in the chat, and it feels natural to insert it in here, thinking about kind of what Floridians can do around kind of all of the kind of effects that we're seeing from the current administration's, you know, rules and administrative you mentioned the medical ban and things like that. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about kind of what's on the ballot this year, what do we need to know about, and how does that fit in more broadly?
Sure. So like, you know, broadly, we're looking at, as you mentioned, you know, House rep seats being open, US Senate seats, governor seats, attorney general seats, and school board races. As we have seen literally school boards turn into war zones. And it has become extremely, extremely volatile, to where there are full-grown adults screaming at LGBTQ kids attending school board meetings, you know what I mean? And we're just in this really volatile space. So it is imperative that we go out and we vote for folks who see people as people, you know? And how does that kind of feed into everything? When you see these attacks, especially when it comes to healthcare for trans people, you can really connect the dots. You know what I mean? You can see it all the way from the Department of Health putting out their guidance to the Agency of Healthcare Administration, to the removal of Medicaid coverage and Medicare coverage for trans people, to now establishing a standard of care. Now, when I've talked to a few folks about that, they're like, well, what's bad about the Board of Medicine establishing a standard of care? Well, there already is one. It's called the WPATH standards. You know what I mean? These are standards that medical providers have followed for decades regarding trans people. But the dangers is that we're seeing doctors who are not really well versed in trans and non-binary care, gender affirming care, that are wanting to create standards of care with a political view instead of looking at it from a human point of view. You know what I mean? And there's just debates on whether that's kids transitioning, whether that's should Medicaid cover gender affirming care, all of these things. But it's important to understand that LGBTQ people are human beings. We deserve healthcare. We deserve rights. We deserve to be happy. We deserve to live authentically. And regardless of all the rhetoric that you hear, regardless of everything, I do want to say that in this space, because that's so important. And that should be the fire under you, you know, to get out and vote. Because if you see the stuff that they say, they're trying to strip away our humanity. Because if you strip away our humanity, then it's easier to take rights from someone that you don't see as human. But it's imperative that we stick to that. It's imperative that we make sure that they understand that we are human beings and we deserve to be respected as everyone else. So, you know, like I work for the C3, so I can't get too much C4 and talk specific candidates and things of that nature. But it is very, very imperative that all of these resources in the chat are super helpful to go through and figure out, how can I read the ballot? What am I looking at? But it's imperative that you do get out there and vote.
Yeah, and figure out kind of which ones. I think a lot of people are like familiar with, you know, the governor's race, or familiar with the Senate race and things like that. But Attorney General race, a lot of you may not know who's running for Attorney General. You may not know what they stand for. You know, there's like I said, there's a governor's race, there's Attorney General's race, there's the U.S. Senate, there's the U.S. House, the whole state Senate, the whole state House, a lot of school boards. And I think it's just really key to be voting, not just this year, but also next year, when we have a lot of, you know, really local elections coming up. You know, you may have your city council election coming up. A lot of these folks, maybe you live in a progressive city and you're able to pass some sort of protective ordinance, at least in your city. But you can't do that without, you know, decent and caring and allies in the city council. So I think it's really important. That's thinking about local voting, because so much of the conversation just gets really tied up in all of the really high up folks that we hear about all the time, even nationally. And I always think about that really hyper local, and those are the people that I'm always researching to see, okay, what are they actually standing for? What are they saying that they're going to do? And it's just not talked about as much. And that's where you also have a lot of power, because a lot of people don't vote in those races. And that's where, you know, really a few hundred votes like really can decide how a city council, how a school board is going to land. That's where a lot of the power is.
An anecdote I like to share is, so in 2017, which was not an election year for most people, but in Virginia, there was a governor's race, and then there was, race for the legislature, and the control of the House delegates came down to one vote, not 1%, but literally one vote. And that is for a fairly large state that has a lot of power. And so it's unbelievable how much power your vote has.
Yeah, and especially here in Florida, I don't think a lot of folks realize that you could travel 30 miles anyway and be in a county or a city that you don't have protections that you would have in another space, and that's so important to acknowledge as well, because situations will happen, and then you pull up, is there a human rights ordinance? Is there, these different things to protect folks? And a lot of times there's not, so it's important to do your research on your candidates to make sure that they do support protecting LGBTQ plus people and see people for people.
So I want to make sure that we have time for a few of the questions in the chat. We kind of touched upon a few of them, but I want to make sure that we get all of them answered. And if you have kind of more questions that you'd like to submit, there's still time. We've got about 10 minutes to go. So first up, so Kaylin and Nicole specifically kind of talking about what you all are doing, and then what also Floridians can do. And I'll try to say this in a nonpartisan 501c3 friendly way, to kind of combat a lot of the things that that are happening in this state, making it harder to vote, having to re-register in order to get a mail-in ballot, taking away ballot drop boxes. One of the specific questions was around St. Pete County. They used to have 15 drop boxes. Now there's much less than that. The hours are changing. I wonder if you all could kind of touch a little bit upon work that you're doing, maybe also like outside of the election too, in your advocacy to make sure that folks are having access to the ballot box, because a lot of these things are getting passed through administration rules, through laws.
I mean, without sounding flip, it's showing up to vote, and it's awful because these laws are now in place to make it harder for folks to show up to vote, to discourage people to go out to vote, besides who they really want to show up to their own base. If you don't show up, this is the kind of stuff that happens, unfortunately. And if you don't prioritize this gives license to elected leaders to say, oh, I can do this. And this is what's happening, in Florida. It's happening in my home state of Texas, which changed their absentee process, their early vote process, all of that to make it tougher. And if folks don't show up this time around in 2 weeks, or now with early voting that started in some places, they're gonna feel empowered to do even more. And so organizations like ARP and Equality Florida and others can show up to advocate, but we can't do it alone. We need your help, not only by showing up at the ballot box, but also showing up and demanding better from our elected leaders. And it's not going to be easy. There's not a silver bullet. I said at the onset, or the outset of this conversation, that it's a shame that the act of voting has become partisan, when it to me is the most American thing that we can do. And but it's the world we live in, and so we're going to have to adapt and get smarter and get more savvy and be more engaged than the other side is, because they're incredibly engaged. They are. And so I wish I had a better answer.
Yeah, no, I agree. It's a tough thing. But one thing I will plug is at Equality Florida, we do lobby days, where we are able to go to Tallahassee and talk with lawmakers. And what's really incredible about that is a lot of times they don't get to meet all of their constituents. And this is a chance for you to sit in front of lawmakers and talk about some of these things. So we do have, there will be bills that will be like, these are the ones that we're talking about, but there is a time where they kind of open the floor and we're able to talk about, voting procedures and all of these things, and things changing. And you can really get the perspective of some folks, whether that is, you're able to talk to on both sides. I will say that, I'm not endorsing anybody. I'm just saying you're able to talk on both sides, and you're able to get those perspectives, and at least they can hear how detrimental it is when you change these policies for folks here. So, as Kaylin said, we cannot do this alone. We would love, if you're interested in volunteering, please come to our website and sign up. Lobby days will be in March this year, because legislative session is March through May, I believe, for 2023. So we would love for you to volunteer and come help us fight.
Yeah, and Sage always we always boost it to the list if you feel like you want some prep. We have a storytelling kind of cohort group training program. If you're interested in storytelling for advocacy, if you're interested in attending a meeting with a legislator, but you're like, I have never done that before. I don't know how to talk to a staffer. I don't know how to talk to a legislator. We definitely encourage you to sign up. I just dropped a link in the chat. You can get trained as a storyteller so that by the time March comes around, you'll get our email telling you to go to Equality Florida lobby days, and you'll be ready and prepped, and you'll be a pro at that point. And one thing that I always kind of talk about, because I remember the first time that I talked to a legislator and I was very, very stressed. And the easiest way to get through it is just to kind of power through it. And then after the first time, it gets so much easier. And it's so much less scary than I think a lot of people kind of think it is. And it's such a powerful way to do work outside of the election. So thank you for bringing up lobby days, Nicole.
Yeah, and just understanding that they're human too. I know they're elected officials and they're sitting in these offices and in the big, capital, but understanding that they're human beings too. They go home to their family, they eat just like us, they bleed red. So when you can kind of see them in that aspect, it's a bit easier. But even I get intimidated. I'll sit in front of some that I've seen on the Florida channel 100 times and I'm like, oh my goodness, but it does get easier. And we do have lobby days trainings, virtual trainings for folks where we kind of go in depth about how to talk to lawmakers. What is this going to look like? So we're not just throwing you, to the wolves. We can definitely prep you as well. But just remembering that they're just human like everyone else.
Yeah, and that's definitely related to kind of some of the questions we're getting in the chat as well. Just thinking about kind of the way that folks often vote maybe against their own interests, thinking about dismantling Social Security and Medicare, Medicaid, and kind of how we can build allies and build coalitions that aren't not just for LGBTQ people, not just with LGBTQ people, but also outside of the community in order to kind of combat a lot of what we've been talking about today. I want to see if you all kind of have anything to say about that, thinking about how can we move forward when there's so many people. I think there's some people that are unreachable. I'll think our former president, probably a pretty unreachable person. I can't convince him to ever support LGBTQ plus older adults, but there are a lot of people who have just never met an LGBTQ person, and having a story that can really change someone's mind, and having that heartfelt conversation and talking about, okay, well, what are you afraid of? Because I don't think that you're afraid of what you think you're afraid of, and having that back and forth conversation. But I want to, anyway, I ended up rambling, but I want to see what you all thought about the two questions from Tony in the chat.
I do think you raised a really good point, Emma, of, the more human face you can put on these issues, it's harder to otherize. And that's what's happening. It's like, I saw it happen a lot with folks in the gay community in the 2000s. Before we started this conversation, we were talking a little bit about how former President Bush used, anti-gay marriage as a wedge issue in his 2004 election to be able to get evangelicals out to vote. And, it took a long time for folks like on this call, folks in other organizations, to be able to change the conversation, change culture. And it's not, it's just because you win certain victories doesn't mean the fight's over. Whether it was reversing Prop 8, getting marriage equality through the Supreme Court, getting workplace discrimination, rights in there, that doesn't mean the fight's over. And now I see it a lot happening with our trans siblings. It's easy to otherize because the representation you see is either in the media and it's skewed to the other way. And when you get to know somebody who is trans, whether it's somebody in your family, somebody in your community, you're like, oh, this person, to Nicole's point, they're a human being like me. They bleed red, they eat the same food, they go home to their families, they like the same bad TV shows I do. It's easy to do that. But the thing about, I wanted to address the question or comment about Social Security and Medicare. Let me start off by saying AARP is nonpartisan, like a lot of the other organizations on here. And so the way we talk about Social Security, Medicare isn't through a partisan lens. It's not about telling people how, a certain party or a certain candidate, believes about these issues. It's about when they're elected, making sure whether they're a Republican or Democrat, they understand the importance of these issues. And we advocate to make sure that they remain protected and strong. And I'll say, look, I have my own partisan leanings as an individual, but I've worked at the ARP a long time, and there have been cases of both Republicans and Democrats coming after the issues and programs that I advocate for. So, you had President Bush and his ill-fated, privatization plan in 2005, and I fought against it because I've been around long enough. And then you had President Obama, somebody personally speaking, I voted for twice, who came out in favor of changing CPI for Social Security, which would have been detrimental to beneficiaries. And so this isn't sometimes it becomes a partisan issue. Sometimes bad ideas are bipartisan, and we've seen that across the board. And so, and as an advocacy organization, regardless of who's in power, we try to push them to go in the right direction. And I think that's something we're going to have to do about, trying to stop otherizing us one another as voters, and getting, regardless of whoever's there, it doesn't feel like it's an existential crisis of who I am as a human being, who I am as somebody who's trying to save for my retirement, and be able to afford healthcare. It's really, really tough. So that's my view of the world. Take it or leave it.
I completely agree. In here talking about we need allies, that's so important. A lot of people ask, how can I be a better ally? And one thing I say is challenge your friends and family. And what I mean by that is we all have heard anti-LGBTQ rhetoric from our friends and family, whether it's a joke or not. And I say a lot of times people don't realize the power that they have. If you say, wait, have you ever met a trans person? What do you know about them? And then here's a little bit about what their experience is. You can get the light bulb to go off in someone's head because they're friends with you, they're family with you. They're going to listen to you versus someone on the TV or someone they just randomly met. But also in here, we have to make arguments that are economically based. What's very interesting is in presentations, I talk about this sometimes with organizations. I said it pays to be inclusive. You have, depending on who you're talking to, you have to feel what their drive is. Is their drive that they want to be diverse? Is their drive money? And I always say, if in the workplace, if your employees feel safe and affirmed, they're going to give you 100%. If they don't, they're going to give you 50%. And the other 50% is going to worry about, am I going to be judged? Am I going to be fired? All of these things. So, it is really important, Tony, I completely hear that, having those arguments, regardless of what side they come from, we do need allies. Allies have been an important part of our movement from the beginning. And it's extremely important that they're, standing next to us fighting. So I completely agree.
Yeah, and that's such a good way to, with 1 minute left, that's such a good way to wrap us up too. I think a through line of this discussion has really been the importance of having those conversations with folks in our community, whether that's family members who are maybe not so affirming, maybe that's people who are really close to you who are like, I'm not going to vote, my vote doesn't matter. Having these conversations with people who are different than you, who are older than you, who are a completely different generation, different gender than you, having these conversations and figuring out what it is that is motivating them, and how you can align. I think we a lot of us have a lot of our interests. We have the same interests, and yet we diverge when we think about how to kind of have our needs fulfilled. And I think if we could come at it from that perspective, I think that will come out better, come out all the more better for it. So thank you so much for you all for joining us today. Thank you to our great questions. Thank you to our amazing panelists and attendees. I'm really grateful for you all taking the time on a Monday night. And it was great to spend some time with you. I want to thank also AARP for their generous support for allowing us to make this happen. Again, we have some great resources in the chat, aarp.org/Florida votes or sorry, FL votes, not Florida votes, just FL votes, or arp.org/FL-vota. So thank you all for joining us tonight. I'll follow up with links and the recording, and feel free to reach out to us whenever if you need anything. Thank you.